February 17, 1986. The Libyan Sahara exists in that liminal hour before dawn when darkness bleeds into grey, when the sand still holds the cold of night and the air tastes of aluminum and distance. A single aircraft materializes from the south, flying so low that its shadow merges with the dunes. The sound arrives seconds after the vision, not the whine of a jet engine, but something deeper, a tearing of fabric as if the sky itself were being ripped apart. The Tupolev Tu-22. Blinder crosses into Chadian airspace at 100 meters, pushing through Mach 1.2, its needle-like fuselage and grotesque wing-mounted pods making it look less like an aircraft and more like some industrial accident that learned her fly. Inside the pressurized tomb of the cockpit, the pilot feels the stick vibrate with harmonic frequencies that shouldn't exist. The weapons officer behind him stares at radar screens, blind to everything beyond the fuselaged skin. Below them, buried in the navigator's station deep within the aircraft's belly, a third man calculates vectors with the knowledge that his ejection seat fires downward, that if something goes wrong at this altitude, he will crater into the Sahara at 700 kilometers per hour with no possibility of survival. The aircraft smells of hot metal, ozone, and something alcoholic from the cooling system. They climb suddenly to 5,000 meters. 3 FIB 9000 bombs, each weighing 9,000 kilograms, each containing more explosive than was dropped on Dresden in a single night, tumble from the bay. The bombs impact N'Djamena airfield with such precision that French intelligence officers will later refuse to believe a human pilot released them. 2 bombs crater the runway. 1 obliterates the taxiway. The airfield dies for 8 hours. The Tu-22 vanishes eastward, trailing ionized air and confusion. NATO pilots who intercept Libyan blinders on delivery flights will report the same thing. The aircraft doesn't look real. Those wing pods, bulbous, swollen things extending beyond the trailing edge, appear to contain something. Weapons, perhaps. Gun turrets built into the wheels themselves, according to some intelligence assessments. But the truth is stranger and more Soviet than that. To understand why the Tu-22 existed, you must first understand what it meant to lose Stalin's favor in 1951. Andrei Tupolev's OKB-156 had successfully reverse-engineered the Boeing B-29 Superfortress into the Tu-4, giving the Soviet Union its first strategic bomber. But Stalin, capricious and vindictive, chose Vladimir Myasishchev to design the next generation. OKB-23 was created by pillaging Tupolev's best engineers. Myasishchev's M4 intercontinental bomber would be the future. Tupolev was informed his services were no longer required for the strategic role. They designed the Tu-16 medium bomber as a survival mechanism, a twin-engine jet that was good enough to avoid complete irrelevance. But by 1954, Western ZE's air defenses were evolving at a pace that made subsonic penetration suicidal. The Americans were testing systems that could track, target, and destroy aircraft at altitudes and speeds the Tu-16 could never achieve. TSAGI, the Soviet Aerodynamics Institute, issued requirements for a supersonic bomber. Tupolev's chief designer, Sergei Mikhailovich Yeager, understood the political calculus. Fail this time, and the design bureau would be dissolved. Build something extraordinary, and perhaps survival was possible. They started with Samolyot 103, essentially a Tu-16 with more powerful engines. Wind tunnel tests revealed it would never reach supersonic speed. Yeager ordered his team to start over. What emerged in 1954 as Samolyot 105 was radical to the point of absurdity. A single pilot bomber, eliminating the co-pilot position to narrow the cockpit and reduce frontal area, with engines mounted not in the wings but atop the fuselage, flanking the vertical stabilizer. TSAGI had discovered that wing root engines caused catastrophic pitch-up at Mach 1. Moving them to the tail solved the problem but created others. The design looked wrong. Western analysts who first saw reconnaissance photographs of the prototype thought it might be a developmental failure, something that would never reach production. They were half right. The wings were the problem and the solution. To minimize transonic drag, Yeager's teams swept them at 55 degrees, so severe that the aircraft would land like a dart, nose high, bleeding speed, always on the edge of stalling. Around this time, TSAGI independently discovered the area rule, the principle that minimizing cross-sectional area variations along the fuselage reduced wave drag. But applying it required the wing roots to be impossibly thin, so thin that the main landing gear, four-wheel bogies designed to distribute the 84,000 kilogram maximum takeoff weight, would not fit inside. The solution was pure Tupolev. Mount the landing gear in external pods at the trailing edge of each wing. Large, spindle-shaped fairings that bulged from the wing like tumors, each housing a bogie that retracted backward into the structure. These pods became the Tu-22's signature feature, visible from kilometers away, so prominent that NATO intelligence analysts debated their purpose. Were they fuel tanks? Weapon bays? Some reports suggested they might house defensive guns, that the Soviets had somehow integrated turrets into the landing gear itself, a mechanical perversion that made a kind of brutal sense given Soviet design philosophy. The truth was simpler. The pods housed wheels, nothing more. But the defensive armament was real, a remotely controlled tail turret located beneath the engine pods, containing a single R-23 23mm cannon. The weapons officer operated it using a PRS-3A Argon gun-laying radar because he had zero rear visibility. His station was buried inside the fuselage, windowless, claustrophobic, a position from which ejection meant dying unless the aircraft was above 350 meters. The gun turret could track targets automatically, compensating for speed and distance with analog computing that was sophisticated for 1959 and obsolete by 1965. Soviet crews called the system reliable. They also called it irrelevant. No fighter ever engaged a Tu-22 in a tail chase. The bomber's defensive weapon existed to satisfy doctrine, not reality. But the cooling system, that was real. Soviet engines bled compressed air for cockpit pressurization and climate control. At altitude, this air reached temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Celsius. Cooling it required a total loss evaporator running on a 40% ethanol, 60% distilled water mixture. Essentially, vodka. The system vented the coolant overboard after use, which meant each flight consumed approximately 40 liters of alcohol. Crews discovered they could access the coolant reservoir. They drank it regularly. Soviet Air Force Command issued increasingly frantic directives, restricted access to the aircraft after flights, unannounced coolant level inspections, threats of court-martial. Nothing worked. The practice continued until the Tu-22 was retired. Western intelligence agencies, monitoring Soviet radio traffic, intercepted conversations about the supersonic booze carrier and assumed it was a cryptonym. It wasn't. It was a literal description. The Tu-22 first flew on September 7, 1959. Test pilot Yuri Alashev reported severe control problems above Mach 1. The aircraft developed aerodynamic heating that distorted control rods, making the bomber sluggish and unpredictable. Landing characteristics were catastrophic. The highly swept wings generated minimal lift at low speeds, requiring approach velocities 100 km per hour faster than the Tu-16. Pilots reported a tendency for the aircraft to pitch up violently just before touchdown, slamming the tail into the runway. Tupolev engineers eventually installed electronic stabilization systems, but the fix was partial. Crosswinds above fresh breeze levels on the Beaufort scale were enough to make the aircraft unflyable by new pilots. The cockpit layout included a high right-side panel that blocked runway visibility during crabbed landings. The crew complained about everything. The cockpit was filled with levers and handles, positioned where no human hand could reach them during flight. Pilots carried metal hooks and improvised tools to manipulate controls. The ejection system was a death sentence, downward-firing seats that required 350 meters minimum altitude, which excluded their use during takeoff and landing, exactly when most accidents occurred. Crew entry involved lowering the seats on external rails, climbing ladders bolted to the fuselage, sitting down and being mechanically cranked upward into the aircraft. It was undignified, it was slow, it was Soviet. First-generation Tu-22 pilots were selected from elite Tu-16 crews, men who had spent years flying with co-pilots and had developed the habit of delegating most flight operations. The Tu-22 had no co-pilot. These experienced aviators suddenly found themselves responsible for every system, every decision, in a cockpit environment vastly more complex than anything they had trained for. Most failed to complete conversion training. The Soviet Air Force eventually recruited pilots from Su-17 squadrons, single-seat fighter-bomber crews accustomed to solo operations. They transitioned with fewer casualties. By the time serial production began in 1960 at Factory No. 22 in Kazan, Nikita Khrushchev had decided the future belonged to ballistic missiles, not bombers. Only 15 Tu-22B bombers were initially built. The program was saved by proposing a reconnaissance variant, the Tu-22R, which could theoretically be converted back to a bombing role in wartime. This fiction satisfied Soviet leadership. The Tu-22R entered service in 1962, followed by the Tu-22K missile carrier variant designed to deploy the massive Kh-22 anti-ship missile. Total production reached 311 aircraft by 1969. For comparison, the Soviets built over 1,500 Tu-16s. Iraq and Libya bought Tu-22s in the 1970s because they were available and because they terrified adversaries. The Iraqi Air Force used them against Iran from 1980 to 1988, attacking Tehran with FAB 9000 bombs dropped using supersonic toss bombing techniques, climbing, releasing, and diving away before anti-aircraft fire could track them. Skilled pilots could place a 9,000-kilogram bomb within 50 meters of a target from 20 kilometers away. The Iraqis became so proficient that they depleted Soviet stocks and began manufacturing their own version, the Nasser 9. 7 Tu-22s were lost during the Iran-Iraq War, including 2 shot down during a raid on Karg Island on March 19, 1988. Libya's Tu-22s attacked Chad and Tanzania, flying missions that were strategically pointless but tactically impressive. That February 1986 strike on N'Djamena, the one that began this story, was conducted by a bomber that stayed beneath French radar coverage for over 1,100 kilometers, accelerated past Mach 1, climbed to 5,000 meters, and delivered ordnance with precision that suggested external guidance. The aircraft encountered mechanical problems on the return flight and likely crashed before reaching its base. French intelligence never confirmed the loss. One Libyan Tu-22 was shot down by captured SA-6 missiles at Ozu on August 8, 1987. Another was destroyed by French Hawk missiles on September 7, 1987, killing an East German crew. The last operational Libyan Tu-22 flew on September 7, 1992. Iraqi Tu-22s were obliterated during the 1991 Gulf War by American strikes. Soviet and later Russian Tu-22s were retired in the early 1990s, replaced by the unrelated Tu-22Me, a variable sweep bomber that shared only a name. 7 derelict blinders remain visible at Al Jufra Air Base in Libya, their wing pods still swollen, still suggesting weapons that were never there. So, did the Tu-22 have gun turrets in its wheels? No, it had landing gear in pods and a gun turret in its tail. But the visual proximity of these features, combined with the aircraft's grotesque appearance and the Soviet habit of designing systems that defied Western logic, created a legend more durable than the aircraft itself. NATO pilots who intercepted Tu-22s reported an impression of wrongness, a machine that looked like it shouldn't fly. They were correct. It barely did. Soviet crews who survived their tours called it Shiloh, the Awl, a tool designed to pierce, to penetrate, to wound. It wounded them more than it ever wounded the enemy. 311 aircraft built, dozens lost to accidents and mechanical failure. A handful destroyed in combat, an engineering marvel that succeeded by failing, a Cold War artifact that proved you could build anything if you were willing to kill enough of your own people testing it. The wheel pods remain its epitaph, bulbous, inexplicable, forever suggesting a weapon that never existed.